Jeff Klapes has been head of reference services at Wakefield's Bee Library for 26 years, where he is also known as the Traveling Librarian, having visited more than 50 countries and 5 continents over the years. He does frequent armchair travel presentations, showcasing the history and culture of various places, using photography to capture people, scenery, and local details. From Iceland to Namibia, Laos to Oman, Jeff has visited many off the beaten path places, as well as more popular ports of call. And of course, as a librarian, he also reads voraciously about his destinations to learn about their culture, history, politics, literature, nature, and cuisine. And I promise you will learn so much during this wonderful visual presentation. This week, we're going on a journey to the rugged southwest corner of England. Cornwall is smaller than Rhode Island, but packed with historic castles and country homes, charming fishing villages, and dramatic rocky coastline, perfect for hiking. In the middle is atmospheric Bodmin Moor, full of legends, prehistoric sites, and windswept landscapes. And I just ask everybody to please mute yourselves for the duration of the presentation. And at the end, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask a question or type your question into the chat, whatever way you feel comfortable. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeff. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. What a great crowd.
Great, and thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to have so many people. This is an enormous crowd. I guess you all want to go to England, or maybe you just all want to go anywhere at this point. I know that's how I feel. Let me make sure I'm going to share my screen, and then we can get started. As Jess said, do feel free to pop questions in the chat as we go along. Are you seeing my screen? Good, okay. I'll try to do my best to answer them as we go along, but we will have plenty of time at the end also. So don't worry, when we get finished with the presentation, if you have any questions, you can always ask them then. And I will get started. This is a trip that I took. Let's get started there. So you can all see the map. Okay, this is a trip that I took in the fall of 2019. So this was actually the last really big and certainly the last international trip I took before COVID hit in the fall of 2019. And we went to visit, it was mostly a vacation, but it was also a really great excuse because we have a number of friends who live in different parts of southern England, and we got to visit all of them on this trip. They live in, I have friends who live kind of near Stonehenge, and we have other friends who live in Oxford and other friends who live near London. So it was a great opportunity to visit some of our international friends who we haven't seen in a while, and also to do some sightseeing. So tonight, make sure my pointer is working. Tonight, we're going to be focusing mostly just on Cornwall, which is the little bit down at the end. And I do have additional programs that cover the rest of southwestern England that maybe we'll have a chance to do at some other point. Just to give you an idea of the size and to put Cornwall on the map, as Jess said, Cornwall is really only about the size of Rhode Island. It's actually quite small. And if I superimpose an outline of Massachusetts over it, you can see how all of Cornwall really fits in just one little corner of our state, but there's an enormous amount that's packed in there. It's about 75 miles from the border in Devon all the way out to Land's End. And it is one of the smallest counties in England with only about 500,000 people, at least smallest by population. So really, as I said, this is only about 50 to 75 miles from here to here. It's bounded on the east by the county of Devon, and the capital, or the county seat more accurately, is Truro, which is actually a pretty small town. It's smaller than Chelmsford. And Cornwall, of course, has a very strong identity of its own. Cornish is still spoken a little bit, but not very much. Unlike Welsh, the Cornish language is not something that you will see very often. Very few people speak it at this point, only about 100. But you will sometimes see Cornish displayed on signs and so forth. Cornwall also has some beautiful natural scenery, which we'll see. And one of the most famous is this green blob that you can see in the middle is called Bodmin Moor. And it's one of the most beautiful spots for country walks and ruins and atmosphere. I always promise food in my program. So yes, there is food. Pretty much everywhere in Cornwall, you will find traditional Cornish pasties, which are very sturdy, filling, either meat and or vegetable pies. It's kind of interesting. They were originally used by tin miners. Tin mining is a big traditional industry way back into the 18th and 19th centuries in Cornwall. And if you can see from the photograph, they have kind of a crimped edge along the sides of the pastry. And the reason they were designed that way is the filling, which is usually either meat and spices or a mixture of meat and vegetables, potatoes, peas, that kind of thing. Modern ones have all kinds of stuff in them. The idea was you could eat the pasty by holding that crimped edge and then discard that when you were done. And there was a reason for that. Tin mining is very dangerous, and there's a lot of arsenic involved in the process of tin mining. So miners who were eating their lunch underground could eat a pasty holding this little crimped edge. And despite the fact that there might be arsenic on their fingers, they could reduce the risk of getting arsenic poisoning by only eating the part that they weren't actually touching and then discarding the crimped edge, which is kind of thick and tough anyway. So today it's just the traditional way that they're made, but it does actually have a useful purpose originally. Another thing that you'll find everywhere is the traditional cream tea, which is even more famous in Devon, the next county over. That's where it kind of comes from originally. And it's served often in the late afternoon as a pick-me-up before dinner. And usually it involves homemade scones with fruit jam, often strawberry or something like that, a little pot of clotted cream, and a freshly brewed pot of good old English tea. The thing that I will point out that we learned while we're there is that depending on which side of the border you're on, determines how you eat them. In Cornwall, you put your jam on first, and then you put the clotted cream on top, and then you eat your scone. In Devon, they are very insistent that it's the other way around. You put the cream on first, and then you put the jam. They are very, very lenient with tourists. So if you're just visiting, they don't care what you do. But it's kind of interesting to see that there is this little local rivalry about what is the proper way to eat a cream tea. We're going to kind of make a tour around Cornwall, around the peninsula. We'll start at the top and work our way out to the end and then back again. I want to start in the northern coast, which looks up towards southern Wales, in a particularly well-known place called Tintagel, which is a nice little village with, to be honest, it's actually very touristy, but it's well worth visiting because the town itself is extremely old. It's 14th century. This building that we're seeing here is the original post office, which has now been turned into the tourist bureau and museum. But it's an adorable little town. I would not want to have to worry about roof repair on this particular building, but you'll see a lot of local traditional architecture, mostly made out of stone. Cornwall will have a feel, a very comfortable feel for New Englanders because it is rocky and very granitic. So most of the building that you see there is made from the same kind of granite that you will see all over New England, the coast of Maine, the coast of Cape Ann, and so forth. It's a very similar kind of style. But Tintagel itself is pretty touristy, and that's because of the castle and its connection to King Arthur, which we're going to visit in just a minute. They get about 200,000 people a year in this tiny little town, and they capitalize on it as much as they can. You can see in this picture, they will sell you all kinds of basically King Arthur tourist junk, but it's great for kids. You can buy a plastic sword. You can get all kinds of crystals and things related to Merlin and magic and so forth. But the big attraction, despite all of the tourism, is that the site is simply stunning. The views up and down the Cornish coast are incredible. It's a very bleak and rugged coastline. The building that you see way up on the top is a very old tourist structure. It's the Camelot Hotel that was built in 1899. The Victorian era was kind of when the site really started to become popular as a tourist destination. And so people would come out on the train from London and spend their days hiking up and down the coast, and then they could stay in a beautiful old Victorian hotel. Today, it's a very simple day trip, but we were lucky to be there on an absolutely gorgeous day. And the reason that you go there is to see this headland, which doesn't look like much. There was a castle here, and now there's very little left except ruins. But the reason it's so popular is because of the supposed connection with King Arthur and his legends. The original castle that exists and for which there are ruins probably dates to about the 13th century. And in fact, that castle was deliberately built to help reinforce the connection to Arthur, which was started by somebody named Geoffrey of Monmouth, who created and sort of popularized the myth that the legendary King Arthur was actually conceived in this location, in this castle. Arthur in general, those of you who know anything about him know that there probably was an actual real historical personage from whom the Arthur legends developed, but most of what we now know as Arthurian legend is mythological. And that hasn't stopped anybody from capitalizing on it if they can. And Tintagel has certainly done a very good job of that. So the real historical connection to anyone who was actually potentially a King Arthur personage is very, very tenuous at best. But that doesn't take away from the dramatic scenery. And you can hike all up and down the coast, explore the ruins, which are very well described. Even if this castle had nothing to do with Arthur, it is a fascinating example of a fortified setting from the Middle Ages. And you can see it's very high up over the ocean. And to get to it now, you used to have to go down this long set of steps, cross down below and climb a similar set of steps on the other side. And just a year and a half ago, in the summer of 2019, they opened this new steel footbridge, which was pretty controversial, you can imagine. But it has still nonetheless made it a lot more accessible, particularly for anybody with disabilities or little kids, strollers and so forth. And it is a remarkable piece of engineering. And once you get out onto the headland, you can explore pretty much anywhere you want to go. There are marked pathways, but there's nothing to prevent you from wandering around and exploring up and down the cliffs. You do have to be careful not to fall off. It is kind of precipitous in a few places. But there are lots of ruins to explore. And you can see how the original castle was sited on this headland for protection, because of course, back in the Middle Ages, there would have been no bridge to get back and forth, and it was very well protected. Here's a statue of King Arthur, that modern contemporary rendition of him that was installed just a few years ago. And regardless of whether you believe in any of the Arthur stories, I think it's really quite an impressive monument to the mythology. And to stand there looking down the coast with the wind whistling over the cliffs is really something. He kind of, he holds Excalibur and guards the headland ominously. I do have to say, it probably took me about 15 minutes to take this picture, because I had to wait while 25 other people wanted to take a picture standing next to King Arthur. People often wonder when they look at my travel pictures how I seem to be the only tourist. And that's only because I spend a great deal of time waiting until people go away so that I don't have other people in my photographs. Um, More mythology that's connected with the site is this very unassuming little plot here, which is a garden enclosure. There are some early versions of the Tristan and Isolde romance that you may have heard of, a famous medieval poem that are supposed to have taken place in this site. In fact, in this specific garden. Once you're done exploring the headland, you can hike all the way down to the bottom, where there are steps that take you down to something called Merlin's Cave. And of course, it has nothing to do with Merlin, but that doesn't matter. It's a fun cave to explore. You can kind of see it off in here. It gets flooded at high tide. And it's a great place to explore, particularly if you have kids. And as I said, it's a lovely place to hike, but you will definitely not be alone. This is looking up at the opposite cliff where there were huge crowds of people because of the lovely weather coming to see the view down the coastline. And Brits do love their dogs. No matter where you go in Britain, whether it's a restaurant, a shop, or a historic site, they will take their dogs with them. And as a dog person myself, I love that. Moving a little further west and actually going inland, we're going to go down towards the center of the highest part of Cornwall to Bodmin Moor, which is a roughly round area of parkland. It's about 80 square miles. And what we're looking at here is, it looks like this is pronounced rough, but it's not. It's actually pronounced Row Tor. Row Tor and the neighboring hill called Brown Willie are the two highest points in Cornwall. They're almost about the same height, roughly 1,400 feet, which isn't terribly high, but given how close it is to the coast and given the bleakness of the landscape, they seem a lot higher than they are. And the whole area of Bodmin is very wild, very windswept. It's been inhabited since Neolithic times. And in fact, we'll see a couple of Neolithic ruins in a minute. And there's a lot of untamed wildlife that wanders around the area, as well as livestock like sheep and cows and semi-wild horses and so forth. It's a great place for bird watching and country walks as well. But the really exciting part of strolling the moors, and particularly this corner of it, is that there are these fantastic rock formations. They look like something that might have been built by Neolithic Stonehenge-aged civilizations, but they are not. What you're seeing here are entirely natural formations. It's all granite. And the reason they're in these weird outcrop formations is because they've been weathered by the elements, primarily wind and water, over tens of thousands of years. And it's a great place for hiking because you can clamber over the rocks and see pretty much, you can actually see the ocean on both sides from this top if the weather is clear. It's a little hard to get a sense of the scale of these boulders, but they are really quite huge. I'll show you a person next to them in a minute. I'm not sure if any of you have read any Daphne du Maurier. She's a famous British writer who spent much of her life in Cornwall, and many of her famous novels are set there, including Rebecca, which is certainly her most famous. I'm sure if you haven't read the book, you've seen one of the film versions. And another one of her famous novels is called Jamaica Inn, which is about smuggling in the 19th century in Cornwall. And if you've read it or seen the film versions, there's a very dramatic, melodramatic ending to the story, and it takes place right here on this particular location. And a couple of the film versions have actually filmed it in this spot. Once you get up to the top, it's extremely windy, but you can see way off that hill that you can see in the distance is Brown Willie. So that's technically the highest point These two hills are only about 10 or 20 feet difference in height. We decided not to hike all the way there. That's about 1.5 miles, which is not terribly far. But the wind was the wind was so bitter that despite the nice weather, we just decided to give up and go back. And again, you can see these rocks that you're looking at, which may not look that big, are actually that pile in the background is probably a good 30 to 50 feet high. Here's a human being next to some of them. Here I am trying to stand upright in the wind. And as you hike around this area, you'll also see things like wild horses and plenty of sheep, which graze wild throughout Bodmin Moor. Although the moor is an official park area, it's so old that there are certain parts of it that are developed and have small villages and farms in them, and those still operate. But there is no new development in the moor at all. It's particularly nice in the late afternoon because as the sun goes down, it kind of gives everything a little bit of a glow. In the very center, if you can remember, the moor is roughly circular, and if you look in the exact center of the moor, there is a road, a very ancient highway that runs east to west across it. And smack in the middle is a very famous inn called Jamaica Inn, which is the one that Daphne du Maurier based her story on. The inn that you can see in this photograph, you can stay in it. It dates from 1750, although there was actually a coaching inn there on the site as far back as the 1500s, and it was necessary because traveling the moor was very dangerous, partly because of pirates and brigands, and partly because of weather and the fact that it's just a very barren, cold, and dangerous place to be if you're stuck out there in the middle of the night. So even today, there's this very nice, cozy inn that you can stay in. Of course, being a modern hotel, it has all the modern conveniences with indoor plumbing and heating and so forth. But they try to keep a little bit of the atmosphere that is associated with du Maurier's novel. And Alfred Hitchcock made a famous film version of the story as well that is worth catching if you can. But the inn still, it's kind of a touristy spot now. They have a gift shop, and you can buy all kinds of copies of the book. Here's an original edition of Jamaica Inn. It's a great story. If you've read any Daphne du Maurier, they're all really good, strong Gothic stories with windswept moors and heroines who solve interesting secrets in gloomy manor houses perched on the cliffs in the rain. They're wonderful stories to curl up with. There is, as I said, a lot of wildlife. We didn't see any otters, but supposedly in some of the streams and brooks, there are otter populations. I do want to quickly show you, though, a couple of the Neolithic sites that I mentioned. They're nowhere near as dramatic as Stonehenge, if you've been there, but they're from about the same time period. Not far from where we just were, there's a little village called Minions. And in that town, there is a stone circle. It's actually quite a bit larger than Stonehenge, although the stones are only about the size of a person. So it's not quite as dramatic, but they are several thousand years old and roughly the same time period, if not a little earlier than the megaliths at Stonehenge. They're called the hurling stones, and that's because there's a legend that there were giants who were hurling the rocks and they were turned into stone, blah, blah, blah. But today it's still a very atmospheric place to visit. There are actually 3 circles, concentric circles of stones, and a couple of other circles outside. You can see we had a mix of weather while we were in Cornwall, including some torrential rain a little bit later. And that's, you can understand that that's why it's green. But as much as I don't like having to deal with weather like that while I'm traveling, I have to say, Cornwall looks beautiful in lousy weather. It's an atmospheric place, and it's part of what makes Cornwall Cornish. So even when it's cloudy and gloomy and foggy, there's something about that that still really makes it a beautiful place to be. Very close to this same site is another one called Trevithy Coit, which is a tombstone, essentially, that would have originally been covered with earth. That earth has all worn away, but it would have been completely, for quite a ways around, made into a big mound. And the stones were stacked up like this so that there would actually be an enclosure inside the mound for the tomb. It's dated to about 3500 BC. And this is all that's left of it now, is the upright standing stones and the huge capstone that's on top of it, which weighs around 10 tons or so. The whole thing is maybe 9 or 10 feet high. What you can't see is that it is right behind somebody's house. This is a beautiful field, but it is literally in someone's backyard. And it must be kind of strange to just live on a side street in this village and look out your back window and see a several thousand-year-old historic site. There's more recent archaeology there as well. This is the remains of an old tin mine. Tin mining really isn't done much in Cornwall anymore, but right up through the late 19th century, it was a major industry there, and a big part of the culture. And many of the towns that we're seeing along the way were connected to the industry either as places where the workers lived or where tin was exported from. Another nice spot to visit is a tiny little town called St. Neot that has a beautiful parish church from the 15th century. This is just on the very far west edge of Bodmin Moor. And it's a kind of unassuming little church, but it's particularly known for its very fine stained glass, which is very early and goes back to the original church in the 15th and 16th centuries. Many of the churches that you might visit have replacement glass that was added in later centuries. But for a tiny little parish church, it has just incredible medieval stained glass, still in very fine condition. But it's a beautiful site as well. One of the crosses that you can see in the graveyard was purportedly given by King Alfred, who visited the village in the late 800s. And supposedly he gave this cross to St. Neot when he was visiting the village. The cemetery is very, very pretty. Although I must admit, I feel bad for this poor person who was named Jonathan Krapp, or I'm sorry, Matthew Krapp. The inside of the church is also very beautiful too. It's kind of simple inside, but in addition to the spectacular stained glass, there's this carved oak rood screen, which is in unbelievable detail, and again, in superb condition. One of the oldest of the windows in the church is this one in the east end, which depicts the creation, the scene of the creation. And it's, of all the windows, it's the one that has been the least restored. So it's kind of incredible that without any restoration, it is still in such beautiful condition. And this is the ceiling to the little entryway. For a small parish church, the detail is really just incredible. Beautiful spot. The village itself doesn't have much to speak of other than a few houses and this general store. But there is a nice little walk that you can take just a couple hundred yards down from the church along this pleasant little waterway that takes you to St. Neot's miraculous well, which is another of the many legends in Cornwall. St. Neot supposedly found this well, and it contained 3 fish. And the idea was that as long as he never took more than 1 fish per day, it would always replenish itself and continually supply the church with food. Of course, at some point, somebody took all the fish out, and now there aren't any fish left. But it makes a great legend, and it is a beautiful little walk through the scenery. It would not be a visit to England without seeing at least one fancy stately home. So we are going to visit Lanhydrock, which is the highlight of the region. It's probably the largest of the country houses in Cornwall, and it is part of the National Trust system in England. In fact, it's one of the largest houses anywhere in all of Southwest England. And for any of you who are fans of Downton Abbey, Lanhydrock is a great place to visit because a lot of it is from that time period, and the way the house is set up as a museum for visiting really highlights the differences between the upstairs and downstairs aspects of life in a country home. The name of the place refers to St. Hydrock, and the property originally goes back hundreds of years, but the current building mostly was built in the 1600s, and then they had a huge fire in the 1880s that destroyed one whole wing of the house, and they rebuilt in the late 19th century in the same style, but with a lot of more modern conveniences. So that brought the house up, essentially up to the 20th century. So there was actual running water and electricity in parts of the house after that rebuilding. In addition to the house, there are beautiful gardens. There's several formal gardens and about 900 acres of parkland where you can go hiking and horseback riding and so forth. The house itself is sort of U-shaped. You enter through the gatehouse and a formal courtyard. Originally, the house did have another wing that sealed off and made a square, but that was taken down a long time ago. This is the main entrance. And the gatehouse was kind of like a hunting lodge that was built in the 1650s when the original house was built. Now it just serves as a monumental gateway to the property. And there's fantastic topiary through the entire garden area. This north wing, which we'll see the inside of in a minute, is really the only part of the original house from the 1600s that survived the fire. And the second story that you can see here with all those windows, we'll see the interior in a minute. That's actually one long hall, one single long room. That's the highlight of the property. The interior, this is looking from the front door back out to the gatehouse. The interior has about 50 rooms that you can explore at your own pace. All of it is decorated in this kind of high Victorian style, which is very similar to the style that Downton Abbey, the actual castle, which is called Highclere Castle. It's much closer to London. But Highclere is a high Victorian style property that this building has very similar style to the interior decoration because it was completely restored in that time period after the fire. So they've done a really good job of explaining the difference between how the family and the owners of the property lived versus all of the servants who kept the place going. And it's just fascinating. This is the dining room, which is in a sort of Jacobean revival style. There's a lot of arts and crafts in the house as well, because arts and crafts style, because that was kind of becoming popular at the very end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century with William Morris and handcrafted woodwork and furnishings and wallpapers and so forth. So you'll see a lot of that through the house as well, the wallpaper in particular. Considering how impressive a house this is, his lordship had this as his bedroom, which is relatively modest. It's nicer than my bedroom, but for a huge country house, this is not anywhere near as fancy as you might expect. It is a very comfortable house. Most of the rooms are small enough that this isn't like a French palace, like going to visit Versailles. You can actually almost imagine yourself living in this. Although I do have to point out that as small as his lordship's bedroom is, the wallpaper is a copy of the wallpaper in the House of Lords. So this is his bathroom, which is also quite nice. And her ladyship had a gorgeous suite of rooms as well, with a bedroom and a boudoir, a special hidden safe built into the woodwork to hide her jewels, but still have easy access to them. And this is the family drawing room up on the second floor. Many of the parts of the house were, it was divided, essentially. The family tended to spend their time up on what they call the first floor, what we call the second floor. The main ground level was more for entertaining. So guests would have spent their time there in formal dinners and balls and so forth. And the family spent most of their time up on this second floor. This is just a small sitting room and office. The billiard room, which was at one point a brew house for making ale, was converted into a billiard room. And in fact, that whole wing was turned into a gentleman's wing. They divided society quite a bit in this time. So not only was there the division between upstairs and downstairs, there was also a very clear line drawn between guests and family, men and women, and adults and children. And you can see that as you go through the house, which sections of the house were designed for the lifestyle of certain groups of people. And clearly this wing was, which had the offices for managing the estate, had the billiard room, the smoking room, and so forth. This was male territory. I mentioned that long hall up on the second floor. This was originally paired with a similar hall on the opposite side, the wing that burned down. And it was used as an art gallery and a library. It is the highlight of the house today. It's 115 feet long, one single room, and the ceiling is absolutely exquisite. It's a plaster ceiling, original, dating back to the late 16th century, when the house was originally built, and it depicts scenes from the book of Genesis as you work your way along. You might wonder, it does look a bit drab. It is quite old plaster after all, and you might wonder why they haven't spiffed that up a little bit. And one of the reasons is because it's so fragile that if they were to actually paint this plaster to make it nice and clean and white again, the weight of the paint would be so significant that it would actually damage the plaster and potentially bring it down. So they have kind of stabilized it in the condition that it's in, and it's just magnificent. The room is also filled with artwork and a very fine collection of early printed works, including 25 books that were published, printed before 1500. And then once you're through seeing all of the fantastic upstairs part of the house, the downstairs part is equally fascinating, if not more so. Note the William Morris style wallpaper here. It's a very good example of it. There are, I can't even imagine how many rooms downstairs. There are probably 15 rooms dedicated just to the kitchen. This is actually the main kitchen hall, which was kind of designed kind of in the style of an old college hall, like you'd see at Oxford or Cambridge, with a very high ceiling and the clear story windows. On the right is the meat larder, And you can tour the entire kitchen area with anywhere between, I want to say 15 and 20 rooms, each of which was specific to a certain function. There are pastry rooms, there are rooms for meat, there are rooms for vegetables, there are rooms for storage of cold foods, the washing of dishes, the storage of the silverware, you name it, it goes on and on. And it really is fascinating. Again, if you've watched it Downton Abbey and enjoyed that sort of backstairs atmosphere, it's fun to actually go into a real house and see just how extensive that was. This is the rotary cooking spit where they could cook multiple large meats at the same time. Here's the dish drying room. There's a separate bakehouse and pastry room. It's really incredible. And then you can also tour the rest of the main house. Also, if you get into the upstairs rooms, up into the attic, you find the servants' quarters and the quarters for the nannies and governesses who took care of the children. This interesting little room up in one of the gables of the attic is a special storage room that was entirely devoted to traveling cases, just suitcases for when the family went places. There was even a special room called the sluice room. These are exactly what they look like. These are bedpans. This room is actually on that upstairs floor where all the bedrooms are, and it has a drain so that the servants could actually just conveniently bring them down the corridor, empty them out the sluice, and they would be washed down into the laundry court in the back of the house. If you wander the area around the house, it's kind of interesting that such a grand and glorious house was not built on the top of a hill. It's actually kind of nestled down at the bottom. So you can climb the hill behind it, and it's a great view because it gives you a good idea of the massive scale of this property. All of the attics that you can see under these gables are full of the servants' quarters. And this whole wing on the right-hand side, which you can tour as part of the visit, is the nursery wing that had about 10 rooms that were just for the nannies and the children. And they spent most of their time in there without going into the rest of the house. I think this photograph alone has something like 16 chimneys. It's an absolutely massive property. In fact, it has its own church dedicated to St. Hydrock, which is about a century or so older than the house itself, but it's now attached to the house, and a number of members of the family are actually buried in the tombs in the church crypt. And there's 22 acres of formal gardens, topiary, there's a kitchen garden, and as I mentioned before, hundreds of acres of parkland. This is the church and the back of that long hall, that extremely long hall with the incredible ceiling. And that's the back of the house. It's surrounded by the most gorgeous countryside. There's very little development in the area, so you just see very traditional rolling English landscape going off into the distance. Because it's such an old property, there's actually an awful lot of mature trees too. There are beeches and sycamores that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. It's not terribly far from Truro, which is our next stop. Truro is the county seat, sort of the capital of Cornwall, but it's not a very big place. I think there's only about 20,000 people in it. But as small a town as it is, it's completely dominated by this cathedral, which is smack in the middle. We treated ourselves and stayed in a country house hotel called the Alverton, which was built in 1830 as a manor house. like Lanhydrock, only smaller. But it was converted to a nunnery at one point. And then after World War II, it was converted into a hotel. So you can now stay there. It was surprisingly inexpensive and very luxurious. This was our room. And the view out of our room. In fact, this is the view from the bathroom. And I mentioned how much Brits love their dogs. We did not have any dogs with us, but if we did, they would have been happy to welcome them. They actually had special dishes for the dogs and a little welcome letter to tell you all about the services that they would offer for your dog while you were staying there. It was a nice place because it was just on the outskirts of Truro, about a 5-minute walk from the center of town. But it was fun to kind of stay in this medieval atmosphere. In addition to the hotel, it's a function hall. Now there is a chapel attached to it that has weddings, and this large building is a great hall that they use for conferences and wedding receptions and that sort of thing. But here is our bedroom right there. Usually when I travel, I tend to stay in much less fancy places than this, but they had a great internet deal, so we decided let's treat ourselves for a couple nights. And Truro turned out to be a very good location because it is right in the middle of Cornwall, of that part of Cornwall. So it's a good base because you can, in less than an hour or so, you can get to almost anything else that you want to see and come back to Truro in the evening. The cathedral, which you can see here, is huge and built in that traditional Gothic cathedral style, but it's not actually old. This is not from the Middle Ages. It was built in 1910, which explains why it doesn't look quite as crumbly as a real medieval cathedral. It's very straight edged, but it gives Truro the feel of a medieval cathedral town, like you'd see anywhere else in Europe. And in addition to that, there's a lot of very nice other buildings. Here's their public library. And a lot of other commercial buildings that are very nice, because Truro was originally a major commercial center. I mentioned the tin mining industry. Truro was a big center for that. Many of the tin mines were within a very short distance of Truro. So the tin would be brought to Truro and then shipped out either by boat or by train through this central location. And it developed into quite a market town. Now it is more of a sort of quiet tourist destination with shops and restaurants, but it's not overly touristy, particularly compared to a lot of the towns on the coast. So it's it's nice to stay there because it's a little bit more of the kind of place people might live as opposed to go visit. There's a lot of nice tiny little alleyways. Here's one called Squeeze Guts Alley. And even a little feel of Amsterdam. There's a number of canals that run through the town behind the houses. And that's the cathedral at night. And our hotel lit up at night. Very close to Truro, probably 45 minutes away, you can get down to the southern coast. This is where Cornwall is getting skinnier and skinnier as we work our way out. So you're never far from the ocean. And I'm sure you've heard of Land's End, which is the furthest west point as far as you can go. And I would have loved to go there, except it is very touristy, and it was torrentially raining the day that we were going to head there. So we decided, let's do something else. We decided to go to the southernmost point in England instead, and that's Lizard Point, which looks a lot like Land's End, but doesn't have anywhere near the number of tourists or gift shops. It's a great spot to visit and go hiking because of the rocky coastline. It's also home to this Lizard Point lifeboat station, which is very historic, but is actually still active. It's still in use. You can imagine this is a coastline that throughout history has had its share of shipwrecks. So there are lifeguard stations up and down the Cornish coast, even today, to keep an eye out for shipping problems. You can see the lighthouse up in the top corner of this photograph. If you like hiking, this is a great place to do it, partly because there's not a lot of up and down. So if you have problems with your knees or you don't want to go too far, English coastal walks are terrific because you can go only as far as you feel like. And you tend to be staying just at the top of the cliffs. So there's not a lot of elevation change if you have trouble going up and down mountains, but you still get incredible scenery. There's also really nice bird watching here, particularly seabirds, obviously. Some interesting plant life. I'm not sure what these were. They're a kind of little succulent that only grows a couple inches high, but they were brilliant orange. And then, of course, there's all kinds of seabirds that dive for fish off the coast. And land-based birds, too. These are magpies. You can pretty much walk around the entire coast of Great Britain for the most part, hundreds and hundreds of miles if you want to, and some people do. But it's great because if you aren't that ambitious and you just want to take a walk for a couple of hours, there are countless places where you can stop, park your car, walk for an hour or so in either direction, and then come back and still see incredible scenery. But Britain has made a concerted effort to link all of those trails so that for anyone who is ambitious enough, you can actually make very long-term circuits that go all the way around the British Isles. If you do walk, though, I would advise you, this is an excellent example of why you should, in many places, stick to the paths, because there's a lot of livestock and there are sheep and cows and they're very messy. So what you see in this photograph is exactly what you think it is. So it's you do have to watch your step. Working our way a little bit again towards the west, we're going to stop in another of the sort of no-miss sites in Cornwall, and that's in the big wide bay of Penzance. St. Michael's Mount is the counterpart to Mont Saint-Michel, which is a much bigger version in Normandy. And although this is a much smaller one, it's still very, very beautiful and has its own personality that makes it similar but different, and a beautiful spot to visit. This is a view across the bay to Penzance in the distance, which is kind of not a terribly touristy town. It's a more of a busy commercial kind of town. The mount itself is on a tidal island, and depending on what the tides are, you may be able to get there by walking across a causeway, or that only happens at low tide, or if that's not possible, you can take a ferry, little boat. The boats are tiny, only seat maybe 10 or 15 people, and it takes literally like 5 or 10 minutes to make the crossing. It has a very long history, going back to a monastery that was built there in the 8th century. Most of the castle and the chapel that you see today were built in the Middle Ages and then significantly rebuilt in the 19th century in a sort of romantic castle style. So it has a mix of different time periods. There's a tiny little port where the boat docks that has some shops and houses. At its height, a couple hundred years ago, there were about 220 people that lived on the island. Now there's almost nobody, but you can still see the village that serves as the port. This VR, I'm sure you can guess what that stands for. That's Queen Victoria, Victoria Regina, who visited the island in 1846. And when her delicate little Victorian foot stepped off the boat, they immortalized it with this bronze plaque. There's some nice views from when you get up to the castle, looking back to the mainland, to the small town of Marazion, which is, you can just see actually, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but there's right along here, you might see a sort of whitish line, slightly lighter color. That is the causeway. And the tides here are significant enough that at low tide, that causeway is exposed and you can just walk out to the island in a few minutes from the pier. The whole castle has been redone in this very romantic style, mostly in the 19th century. But it's craggy and beautiful, and particularly for kids. If you grew up reading stories about castles and knights, and you become a kid again, and you can clamber all over the place. And like Lanhydrock, you can visit most of the interior of the castle at your own pace. And inside, this is the entrance to the main front and the Great Hall. As castles go, this is pretty intimate. Most of the rooms are actually pretty small scaled. But it's a fun place to explore because every little nook and cranny, when you look out the windows, has a spectacular view of the coastline or the ocean. This is not part of the National Trust. This is actually still a privately owned property, still owned by the St. Aubin family, who have lived here since the 17th century. So this is still their house, and they still live in part of it at certain points of the year. It's surprisingly comfortable. But just every little room is beautiful. And there are gardens as well. It's not a terribly big island, but if the weather is nice, you can explore the terraced gardens that go all the way down to the rocky coastline. Because Cornwall is so influenced by the Gulf Stream, you will find a lot of the gardens in this part of the country have flourishing wild plants that you wouldn't expect in such a northern climate, because the Gulf Stream keeps this area relatively mild. In fact, you may occasionally run across palm trees in some of the coastal towns. You can explore all the outdoor terraces. It almost feels like you're on a ship because you're perched up on these ramparts high above the sea with the wind coming at you. This is the entrance to the church, which is the oldest part of the structure that is from the 12th century. The castle was mostly built around the church, and the church is nestled in the middle of it now and still retains its original look. If you keep going a little further down the coast, think of Penzance Bay as a very wide, shallow bay with the mount is in the middle. Way over on the west side beyond Penzance is a tiny little town called Mousehole. It looks like Mousehole, but it's pronounced Mousehole. And it is the Rockport of Cornwall, one of many actually. Another village, quaint fishing village with a very long history, but now it's just a pleasant little tourist spot with a charming little protected harbor, all in granite. As you can see, popular surfing destination and boating. But like most of the Cornish coastal villages, it has lots of little narrow streets with a very New England feel, all of this granite, sometimes whitewashed, as you can see in here. Mousehole is also the, supposedly the place where this unusual food was created. They have an annual festival every year, I think in the summer. And this is a food called Stargazy pie, which is, it's a typical kind of British pie, like cockaliki pie and steak and kidney pudding and those kinds of things. But the fish are actually their heads and tails stick out, and that's why they call it stargazy pie, because the fish can look up at you. I did not find a single restaurant that actually served it, and I did not find it in any store to buy. So I have a feeling it's one of those ancient traditions that is great for horrifying the tourists, but nobody actually eats it anymore, except for once a year when they do this big festival. Many of the towns along the Cornish coast, we're going to finish the program by going through a few of them. They don't necessarily have a lot to do. They have shops and some places where you can get some snacks and nice restaurants and cafes and so forth. But most of them are just pleasant little seaside towns where you can imagine spending a summer vacation and going to the beach, doing some boating, and strolling up and down the coastline. We're working our way back east now in our circuit. And another important parish church that I want to show you is called Gwenup, which is a tiny little village that has very little in it besides this church. It is considered one of the prettiest churches in all of southern England. And for a parish church, it's really quite something. The foundation is very old. Most of the church that you see now is from the 1600s. It's unusual for the area in that the bell tower is actually separate from the main body of the church, which is not very usual for England. It also has some very good stained glass and a very atmospheric graveyard. And right nearby is one of the biggest things to see in Cornwall. I would rank it up there with Lanhydrock and St. Michael's Mount. The Eden Project worked out very well for us because it was a very rainy day, and this was a great activity to do indoors because it is one of England's finest gardens. If you're at all into gardening, and the British certainly love their gardens, it is one of Britain's best and most unusual botanical gardens. It's not far from the town of St. Austell, and just a few miles inland. And it was constructed only 20 years ago on the site of an abandoned clay pit. Clay mining was another one of the big industries that they had there in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this huge empty pit left over from the mining project turned out to be a perfect location to build these geodesic domes that they're much bigger than they look. They're in most cases a couple 100 feet high. They cover two major biomes. One is tropical and one is Mediterranean. There are acres and acres of outdoor gardens as well, but the architecture of the domes is a lot of fun in and of itself. And if you do have lousy weather, it's a great way to get a little bit of nature while staying dry. So one huge section of this is all Mediterranean plants with a sort of semi-dry but tropical climate. And then there's the really tropical domes that are very wet, very humid. If you've been to places like Kew Gardens, just outside of London, this certainly equals it in terms of the research that they're doing and the amazing collection of plants. But it's completely modern instead of being Victorian. And because it's so huge, the trees can be full size. They have really extensive plantings. You can actually climb across the catwalks across the top to get an amazing view. And in addition to the exhibition of the plants, they also have a huge environmental education center that has exhibits about plant life and ecology, and an art museum that is all art inspired by plant life in some way. This unusual thing that we're looking at here is actually a stone sculpture. It's one single giant stone sculpture that evokes a seed or pollen, and it's about 20 feet high. There's also this fascinating art installation that I want to say this is probably 30 feet high. I mean, you can see how big this room is. And it's a big ceramic sculpture that is supposed to, according to the artist, is supposed to recall the early cyanobacteria that in the earliest history of life developing on Earth, those are the creatures that began to produce oxygen 3 billion years ago, and gradually led to plants and multicelled organisms and so forth. So what it does is it just, every once in a while, these little holes that are pinpricked all over it occasionally puff out perfumed steam in little smoke rings that have a smell that is supposed to recall what the artist thinks that the early atmosphere would have smelled like. So it's a kind of weird thing, but the kids love it. And so do the adults. It's just fun to watch. But the gardens and exhibits themselves are really extensive and very informative. The amount of detail that they've gone into to explain where the different plants come from, how they grow, what they're used for, is really extremely well done. There's a little bit of wildlife, mostly just some birds and insects running around in the undergrowth. But if you are at all interested in plants or gardens, do not miss it. And if you're lucky enough to be there on a good weather day, you can be outdoors as well as indoors. There are plans, from what I understand, to build a second version of this in the north of England, way up on the coast in Lancashire. But I haven't heard anything lately about whether that project is moving along. I imagine that's a few years into the future. Heading back towards to the south coast, I just found this an amusing sign. There are parts of England that are very official and they follow rules, and then there are other parts where it's just very relaxed. If you want to go to this particular spot to see the beach, you can drop your 50p in the milk churn by the farmhouse on the way, and it's all honor system. We're going to finish the tour by going through a string of little villages along the coast that are mostly old fishing villages. This is tiny Polperro, which is on the at a little inlet on the mouth of the River Pol, where it gets its name from. It's a quaint fishing village that started in the 1200s. Much of this coast, we're now again on the southern coast, looking out at the English Channel. This whole stretch of coast for centuries was known for smuggling as well as fishing. So pilchards were the big fish that was harvested. And even today, that still happens to some degree. It's a kind of herring. So pilchard fishing and pilchard processing, once they were brought back to shore, was a big industry and part of the economy there, but also smuggling, which is where Daphne du Maurier got a lot of her plot lines for the novels that she wrote here in the 30s and 40s. Now, most of these little towns are swamped with tourists in the summer, but for the rest of the year, we were there in the fall, September and October. It quiets down considerably. The weather is still reasonably pleasant, but you won't get the crowds that you do in the summer. And there's a lot of narrow little streets that just wend their way down past the whitewashed houses. And eventually you get to the little harbor. We were there at low tide. This is kind of an amusing picture because you can see all of the boats have stuck themselves into the mud flats with their keels, just waiting for high tide to come back up again. It's a charming village and a great place to stop and get a cream tea or a Cornish pasty, and then do some walking along the coast. Polperro actually has its own beach. It's not much to speak of because this is about all there is, but it is a pleasant little sandy beach right at the mouth of the river. And a little further on, even an even older town, this is a 7th century village, where the River Foy comes out into a much wider estuary than in the previous village. This is a slightly larger town, but its history parallels Polperro, the same kind of thing: boat building, fishing, pilchards again, smuggling, and so forth. There's a parish church and an interesting, quirky old mansion there. Because this is a slightly bigger town, it attracts more tourists and has for quite some time. So it has more of a seaside feel, with these Georgian row houses that are very common along what they call the English Riviera, where there are lots of these seaside communities where people go during the warm summer months and rent a place for a few weeks. This is actually the river mouth. You can see how wide it is. Polruan is the town on the opposite side, and it's completely filled with boats. You are never far from the Cornish bakery. We discovered that almost every block in any one of these towns, you can get a pasty. Like these. Pasties, because they're so traditional, they do have a certain, there are certain traditional ingredients that go into them. But of course, nowadays you can get tikka masala and all kinds of interesting vegetarian ones and different kinds. The next village along this stretch is called Loo. Actually, I should say it's the Loos, because there's East and West Loo on either side of the River Loo. It's another little whitewashed town with hilly streets, very similar. I feel kind of like Loo is missing out on some tourist publicity, because of course Loo is also a British slang word for toilet, and I feel like they really need to have the Loos in Loo and so forth. But probably they're tired of hearing that joke over and over again, so they don't seem to do much with that. There are a lot of shops, a lot of pubs, and a very nice harbor. You can see East Loo across. The friends we have who live in not far from Salisbury are very typical British vacationers. They have their own camper van. And so in vacation time, they just drive around and find campsites and spend time exploring the British Isles. And they have often gone to Loo. They love it there because there's so much to do, and it's close to the ocean, and there's a really nice beach. And again, very convenient access to all of the coastal walks. We're going to finish the program in one last country home, which I'm going to show you because it's quite a bit different from a lot of the others that you might see. It's called Coteil, and it is a Tudor house from the parts of it go back to 1300. Much of it is from the 1400s. But it is a Tudor period house, and it's important because it is one of the least altered of any country homes from that period. So you can get a good sense, a more realistic sense of what life would have been like during that time period. So unlike Lanhydrock, which is very 19th century, Downton Abbey, turn of the century into the 20th, this Coteil is very, very medieval in feel. The interesting display that you see in the front is made of apples. Coteil has a large orchard with lots of different kinds of apple trees, and they were having a festival at the time that we were there, because it was the fall, so they were apple harvesting, and they had done this interesting display as you enter the main house. It's a very atmospheric house. Like Lanhydrock, it's huge. The house itself is only one part to visit. There are 1,300 acres on the original property that go all the way down to the River Tamar, which is maybe half a mile from the house. It is the ancestral home to the Edgecombe family, which lived in it for many centuries. Like most of the houses in this area, it is made of the local granite, the local slate, and it is built around a central courtyard. And then the East Range, which is this part that you can see over here, was remodeled in the 19th century. So that part's a little bit more comfortable. And on the back side of that, it looks out onto some very lovely formal gardens. But most of the house in the interior, this is the Great Hall, is a superb collection of period rooms from the 13th and 14th centuries, with an unbelievable collection of decorative arts, furniture, textiles, silver, pottery, and so forth. There's also a lot of tapestries as well, and you can visit a number of the different bedrooms, drawing rooms, and dining rooms. This is the tower. They call this the drawing room, but it's actually a dining room, and it's in the tallest part of the structure, which is the old tower, which is also the oldest part of the building. There is a chapel inside, which has some lovely stained glass. And just like at Lanhydrock, they've done a really good job explaining the back stairs, the upstairs, downstairs thing. So although it isn't quite as large as what you'd see at Lanhydrock, they have all the kitchens and servants' areas open. And it was a nice comparison because, again, Lanhydrock was late 19th century Victorian. This is the same scope of a house, the same scale of a house, but several centuries earlier. So all of the way that management of the house would have been done was completely different. But like Lanhydrock, for some reason, instead of being built on a hill, it's nestled in this little copse underneath a slope, and it has a very haunted feel, particularly on a gray day. It would make a perfect place to film creepy films. You can see this is that tower that I mentioned, which is the tallest and oldest part of the property. A nice part of the tour of Coteil is that there's very little natural light, which has its pros and cons. The disadvantage is that it makes it harder to see some stuff, but it gives you a better feel of what the lighting levels would have been like. They are really trying to make it seem not like a museum, but more like what it really would have been like at that time. And beautiful gardens, kitchen gardens and formal gardens. And like a lot of these other places, it's a great place for kids to explore because it's a big creepy castle, but it has tons of little places that you can go and play hide and seek and explore. So we're going to end there. I do have to show you, as we head back towards Devon, which is a completely different program, I did have to point out that one of my favorite aspects of Britain is the humorous names. We didn't actually get to Splat because there's not a whole lot to see there, but maybe on my next trip. And the continuation of this trip was a visit to a lot of the pretty seaside towns on the Devon coast, where people go to spend their summer holidays and take their dogs to go walking on the beach. So I'm going to quit there and unshare my screen. And now should be able to see me again. And you do feel free. I'm going to take a quick look at the chat just to see if there's any questions there that I missed. And do feel free to unmute yourself. And if you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to hear what you have to say. Someone was asking, when did we go there? We were there in mid to late September, early October. And this was just a year and a half ago. Someone also was talking about the fact that I didn't miss anything at Land's End. Yes, that's exactly how we heard it described. Lots of crowds, lots of honky tonk. Does anyone have any questions? Or do feel free also, if you've been to Cornwall, share your stories too. I always like to hear what other people's experiences were. Other good fiction recommendations. I'd have to think about that. Pretty much anything Daphne du Maurier, certainly. But what else did I read that was specifically? I'll have to get back to you on that. There's a lot of stuff that is very, there are a lot of good Cornish writers. She's the most famous, but she's hardly the only one. I want to say Victoria Holt is kind of in that category, but she's kind of dated at this point. Talk to either email me or talk to your local librarians in Chelmsford, and they can definitely find you some good writings about Cornwall.
Yeah, we have a big British literature fan on our staff, so definitely
Good.
send us a message.
Someone was mentioning also the bridge in Tintagel, which was opened only about a month or two after we arrived. I did not actually, I'm not great with heights, but I have to admit the bridge didn't bother me at all. So it's very sturdy. It doesn't sway at all. It's a very solid bridge. And yes, we did travel by rental car. Britain has a pretty good public transit system, but to get to a lot of the places that we saw tonight, you would either need your own car or you would need an enormous amount of time to be able to take buses and trains. The train system does go all the way out, certainly out to Truro and I think beyond. I think it goes as far as Penzance. But a lot of the beautiful countryside stuff, like if you wanted to go to Bodmin Moor and all these little towns, you really need a car to be able to do that. And the driving is fine, although I must say that driving on the wrong side of the road was not the thing that I had the biggest trouble with. I'm not a timid driver by any means, but and I have no trouble driving on the left. But there are a lot of parts of rural Britain where the roads are extremely narrow, and by narrow I mean they actually cut little. They cut the shrubbery because it's so close to the road, so that there's room for your rear view mirror as you're going by. So there are places like that where if you're not used to that kind of driving, or even if you are, and there's people coming, locals coming the other direction who are familiar with the roads, it can be a little stressful, particularly if you're doing that while being on the opposite side of the road at the same time. But the larger roads and certainly the highways, it's no problem at all. It's delightful to explore the countryside and just go wherever you want. Someone says rent the smallest car you can get. Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
We were very pleased. We always do that anyway, just because they get better mileage and we like tiny cars. But ours was really skinny, and that's what you want. Did I miss any questions? I don't think
No, I
so.
don't think so. I think someone else was asking about the travel presentations, other travel presentations you have.
I have lots of travel presentations. If you, I expect to be doing some more with the Chelmsford Library as we go through this year.
Yep.
But I also do them at the Wakefield Library roughly once a month. So particularly with Zoom, since everything's on Zoom now, you are, it's just as easy for you to sign up and attend a program at the Wakefield Library as anywhere else. So feel free to check our calendar and participate in any of those programs. I also If you know anyone who wanted to come tonight and couldn't, I have this program recorded. I believe Jess also recorded it for you guys, but I have a recording on the Wakefield Library's YouTube channel. I have a number of my travel programs pre-recorded there that you can just watch at your convenience, and I'm adding to that over time.
That's great. Thank you.
I forget, Jess, do we actually have another date already scheduled or not yet?
We do have a date for April. I think we're still trying to finalize the actual topic.
You were saying possibly Norway.
Norway, yeah. Norway was the next one that was the next most popular choice among all of the options you have. But I'm going to, yes, let's do Norway.
Okay. We'll plan on Norway.
Okay, it's April 7th at 7 p.m. it looks like.
I did just see one last question about the libraries. I go to libraries everywhere I go if I can. If you're a librarian, you just do that. Britain has had a real problem with their libraries in recent years because of budget cuts. So a lot of the public libraries that they have very limited hours. So in many of the places that we went, they had what looked like a nice library, but they weren't open when we wanted to go in. So Britain is one of the few countries that has a library system kind of akin to what we have in the United States, but it still doesn't compare. And many similar sized towns, if you think of, for example, Truro, which is, like I said, Truro is the county seat for all of Cornwall and has probably 20 or so thousand people. Their library had very limited hours. It was a beautiful old building, but we never were able to go in. And compared to the libraries around here, where in the Boston area, every single town, even a town with only, like Boxford or Newbury, they all have their own little library. That's not true in Britain to the same degree that it is here. But in general, yes, if there is an open library, I visit it because that's what I do. So thank you all for coming, and I guess I'll see you first week of April, and we'll go to Norway.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for another wonderful presentation.
Thanks a lot. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.